I don't want to hog all these, I'll just hog a few. The rest I'll sit down. Very well, Shavua Tov to everybody. Hanukkah Sameach. That's also an interesting question. I just got an email the other day from a friend, a follower of mine in Australia, as it happens. He's into Dikduk, into Hebrew grammar. And he wrote to me, tell me, are you supposed to say Hanukkah Sameach or Hanukkah Smecha? Which is interesting, an interesting question. I guess it depends on whether you mean to say Hag Hanukkah Sameach, in which case it would be Sameach, or Hanukkah should be Smecha, but that doesn't matter. The point is that we're here celebrating Hanukkah together, and we're going to speak a little bit, to begin with at least, about Hanukkah. I live in Yerushalayim. Not far from my home is a street called Rehov Yehuda Maccabi, Judah the Maccabee Street. Now, who here, I'm not going to ask who has heard, I'm going to ask who has not heard of Judah the Maccabee. Everyone's heard of Yehuda Maccabi, correct? Never heard of Yehuda Maccabi? Okay. Don't feel bad, it's fine. Judah the Maccabee, Yehuda Maccabi, was the military leader and political leader of the Jews at the time of the revolt against the Greco-Syrian Empire, 2,186 years ago, give or take, which are the events of Hanukkah that we are celebrating. His name is well known in the Jewish world, but it was pointed out many years ago by Professor Yosef Klausner, a well-known historian who moved to what was originally at that time Palestine and later Israel. He was a well-known historian. He wrote a 5-volume work on the history of the Jewish people during the Second Temple period. In the 3rd volume of that work, page 47, he makes the following point. He says, look in our own sources, the Talmud, the Mishnah, Midrashim, works from Chazal. Do we find the name, so he asks, do we find the name of Yehuda Maccabi mentioned, even once? And the stunning fact is that he's not mentioned even once. So how do we know about him? Professor Klausner points out that we know about him because of something called the Christian Church. The first book of the Maccabees, which was originally written in Hebrew, but we haven't got the original, we only have a Greek translation that goes back about 2,000 years, was preserved by monks and scribes in monasteries from that time down to the present. They preserved it as an important book. It wasn't part of the Bible, even in their eyes, but it was something of value, and they preserved it. They copied it and preserved it. And in more recent times, it was translated back again from Greek into Hebrew, so we can read it, for those of us who don't know Greek. And that's a very important fact that we have this book, because this book, the first book of the Maccabees, is a very factual, very reliable, down-to-earth account of the events of that time, together with the writings of Yosef ibn Matityahu, Josephus Flavius, and certain other sources. We put all those things together, we can get a fairly good picture of what happened at that time. And it's a very strange fact that Professor Klausner makes us aware of, forces us to become aware of, that were it not for the efforts of Christian monks over centuries preserving this text, we would not know the name of Yehuda Maccabi. And we have to ask ourselves why this is. His response, or his essential view on this, was that Hazal, the sages, suffered from a mistaken outlook on Judaism. And not to put too fine a point on it, he's attacking what most people today would identify as Haredi Judaism. That was his view, that the Hazal were essentially, in some manner, you could describe them loosely as Haredim, as ultra-Orthodox, and therefore they lost the national dimension of Judaism, and therefore they didn't speak about it because it wasn't important to them that there was this man who managed to build an army made up of composed of peasants and farmers who had never been fighting men. In fact, at that time, at the time of the revolt of the Maccabees, you should keep in mind that the Jewish people had not fought a war in 4 centuries. The last time they fought a war was against the Babylonians, who captured the city in 586 BCE, and we're talking here about 175 BCE. So 400 years plus, the Jews hadn't fought a war. They were living under Persian, Babylonian, then Persia, the Persian Empire, and then later the Greeks. Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and took over control of huge parts, huge territories, including Eretz Israel. And the Jews had not been independent and did not have an army. The fact that you had people who could somehow create an army, almost yesh me'ayin, something from nothing, ex nihilo, and defeat a very powerful empire, the Greco-Syrian Empire, and a very professional army that they had. In the eyes of Professor Klausner, this is a kind of blindness that the sages were suffering from. I didn't see how momentous and how wonderful these events were. Therefore, they didn't talk about it. Shabtai ben Dov, however, takes a different view on this whole matter. And I think his view and his interpretation is much more likely, much more reasonable, and much more balanced. First, briefly, a word about Shabtai ben Dov, because I know that most of you haven't heard this name before. He was born in Vilna, in Lithuania. His father died when he was a fairly young boy. I think he was 8, and after that time, just before the Second World War, or a little before actually, in the early 30s, they moved to Tel Aviv, what was then Palestine, he and his brother and his mother. He grew up in Tel Aviv, became a teenager in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, of course, then, as today largely, unfortunately, but then it was even more so in some ways, was a very secular place. And even though he came from a somewhat traditional family at least, he sort of dropped his connection to Jewish tradition at that point in his life. And then he begins to relate in his he wrote a small autobiographical work in which he describes these events, and he explains how he became disenchanted and dissatisfied with the kind of education he was getting in school in Tel Aviv at that time, and the general societal norms that were accepted and the way people thought. And he began to think a bit for himself, and that's the main thing about Shabtai ben Dov. He was a tremendous mind, a person who thought, and he was self-taught. He was an autodidact in many ways, even though he studied law at university after the state was established. But most things he learned by himself. He was incarcerated by the British for 6 years because he belonged to the Lehi, what the British like to refer to as the Stern Gang, what we call Lehi Hameh Herut Israel. And he was only released from jail by the British when the state was established in Tashkent in 1948. Right? When he was about 28 years old, Shabtai ben Dov began a process of Chazara b'Teshuvah, self-motivated Chazara b'Teshuvah. He taught himself Torah, he taught himself how to learn Gemara. He relates that in a space of 2 months he went through all of Seder Nezikim. That tells you something about his intellectual prowess. And he became a very serious philosopher, thinker, etc. So, that was just a few words about Shabtai ben Dov. An important name to know. His collected writings were published for the first time some years ago in Israel, 4-volume set, which is, by the way, also available free of charge on the internet. Just type in Hebrew, or maybe in English also, Shabtai ben Dov, and you get all 4 volumes, all his writings appear there. Very worthwhile, but I warn you, it's heavy going. He's a very, very highbrow Hebrew. He's a great mind, but it's worth every moment. So, back to our topic. Shabtai ben Dov takes this comment this big question mark that Professor Klausner leaves us with regarding why we don't know about Yehuda Maccabi from the Talmud, from the Midrash. And he says, really, that's not the right question. The question that we should be asking, he says, is a different one. And that is, why do Chazal and why does the Tanakh not relate to us the history of the entire period of the Second Temple? That's the real question. He says, this is just one episode in a period of history that stretches over 5 centuries. The real question is, why don't we have our own authentic historical record of that period? If, after all, if you talk about the first Commonwealth, the period of the first Mikdash, we have in the Tanakh many books that relate to us many of the events, certainly not all the events, but the important events as it was understood by Nevi'im that took place at that time. We have, of course, Sefer Yoshua and Sefer Shofetim and Sefer Malachim and Sefer Shemuel and other books which relate to the history of the time, not in a neutral way, in a critical way, and tell us this was wrong, this was correct, this was good, this was bad, but we hear what was going on. In the Tanakh, what we find is we have 2 historical books, one Ezra and one Nehemiah, which tell us about the very beginnings of the return of a small number of Jews to Eretz Israel when they were allowed to return by Koresh, the Persian Emperor Cyrus. It's recorded in Sefer Ezra that only 43,200 Jews decided to pick up and return to Eretz Israel. Not a very large number. And we have the last 3 of the prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, who lived at that time. There are a few references to certain events that were going on at that time. And that's it. All of a sudden, the Tanakh is sealed. The Tanakh ends. The story, as it were, the history of the Jewish people is no more. But that's not so. The Jewish people continue to exist. And that's why we're here around this table discussing this right now. And many important things took place. So why did the very same people who wrote the Tanakh up to that point, the Nevi'im and their students, why do they not continue? That's one question. And the other question is, why didn't Chazal, okay, maybe not part of the Tanakh, but why didn't Chazal discuss some of these things? Give us a general historical synopsis, at least, of what was going on. Chazal don't do this. So Shabtai Ben Dov says that Professor Klausner is onto something, but he himself doesn't really understand what he's onto. The real question, therefore, is why is most of the Second Temple period a black hole in terms of our knowledge about Jewish history? And if it were not for some Christian monks, and on the one hand, and for Josephus Flavius on the other hand, who's a flamboyant and controversial figure, shall we say, who was actually writing for the Romans, and for the Roman world, not for the Jewish public. If it wasn't for that fact, we wouldn't have very much information at all. In order to explain this riddle, and it is a riddle, Shabtai Ben Dov points us, first of all, to the Gemara, in Masechet Yoma, Daf Tayit Amud Bet, 9b. Yoma Tet Bet. There we find the well-known question and answer given by the Chachamim regarding the destruction of the first and the second temple. The first statement there goes as follows. It says, we know why the first temple was destroyed, because it's explicitly mentioned in the Tanakh many times. The Jewish people were transgressing in many ways, mainly Avodah Zarah and Gilui Arayot and Shefichut Damim, which means Avodah Zarah is foreign worship, idol worship, foreign gods, not worshiping Hashem. Shefichut Damim is bloodshed, and Gilui Arayot means different forms of sexual impropriety.